Thanks for coming on, Jasper. I appreciate that.
Oh,
Um,
my pleasure.
and so, looking forward to chatting about theories of time. You had mentioned in Facebook that you had a friend, or there was what caused your interest in talking about this tonight? Like you had a friend or something like that.
Yeah, yeah. Because in the Philosophy Society, at my university, the University of Sydney, it's one of the highlights of my week. It's great. Um, and especially because I formed a small little group of friends, all of which are very interested in the question of whether theism is true or not. And so there's essentially two guys in the group. Well, there's two guys called Quinn, both of which are atheists, and then myself and a guy called Liam. We're both theists, and so we like every week we'll just chat about theism, atheism for like 4 hours or so. Um, and so over time, our like metaphysical frameworks have moved around a bit as we've chatted and discussed things. And due to the fact that the argument from contingency is one of my favorite arguments, we'll often discuss contingency, necessity, the properties that are associated with contingency, necessity, those types of things. And so it's led um, one of the Quins to take essentially what he calls a modal collapse argument and just say that the universe is necessary, but particularly it's necessary on a B theory of time, so that all that exists is like a stationary block of space time, and that exists necessarily. And so we've kind of been discussing that, and it's because he's also doing philosophy, and he's taken the philosophy of time course that my university does, but I haven't yet. And so we've been chatting a little bit about time, but yeah, definitely keen to look into it a little bit more.
Sounds good. Now, has he given reasons for affirming the B theory?
Yeah. His two main reasons is he would say that A theory, like the two main problems with A theory in his mind is the mechanism of the passage of time. Like, how does something move from the past, present to, well, move essentially the present keeps moving from the past to the future. And so he's saying, well, like there isn't quite like a reason as to why I should accept that moves. You have like there's not been like proposed any mechanism that he would see as fruitful in that sense. And then because he's also talked about like the postulation of a meta time as well to kind of explain it, but then he just says that a similar problem arises in terms of the passage of meta time and so on and so forth. And then the second reason is looking at um, like general relativity in I think I always get mixed up between general and special relativity, but in the sense of the fact that you can experience time differently. Like for example, if I was to travel at near speed of light and then return to Earth, the passage of time would have been completely different for myself and the people on Earth. And so there seems to be this subjectivity in regard to time itself. So if that kind of makes sense, is the two reasons why he holds a B theory.
Okay, yeah, sounds good. That's pretty common, relativity. That's an interesting one with the mechanism for the movement of time. So, first, I think I want to kind of address those two things, and then we can look at some positive reasons to reject the B theory. So, the first one is his account of the movement of time. Um, I wonder if he is thinking of the expanding block theory of time, which has its own problems. The expanding block theory maintains temporal becoming, and what it says is that essentially the present and the past is actual, but the future is being actualized. So you can imagine like a space-time, same thing as the B theory in the sense that there's a space-time block, but that there really is a true edge of it that's becoming present in the future. And so if that's the case, then yeah, it's I would wonder how you would account for the block growing in that case. So maybe that is his worry on that. Now, there's actually, and we won't get too much into it because he's not defending and you're not trying to take the block theory. But there's actually a paradox called McTaggart's paradox that shows a problem with that theory. And essentially, it shows that you would have to say mutually exclusive things about the same moment in time on that theory. But we won't get too much into that because again, it's not a theory that you're trying to have and he's not trying to have. Instead, what I would recommend is presentism and the relational view of time. So presentism maintains that the only moment is the present moment. So there's not like the past no longer exists and the future does not yet exist. And there's time is the relational view holds that time isn't a substance. There's not like a thing that we're in with time, but rather that time is relational. And so let's suppose that there's only one thing in the universe, and we'll call it A, right? And then A has whatever its property is. It can change from A into B, and then it can change from B into C, and so on and so forth down the alphabet. It doesn't matter what it is. We'll just call it A, right? And it has this capacity. Well, on the relational view of time, at T1 there's A, and A is the only thing that exists. And there's not like a time that it's in. There's just A, and then A changes into B, and it remains the only thing that exists. It's just that it's now B, and so we would say that it was once A, but it's now not A, and so A is in the past, the earlier than relationship, the state of A, which is no longer actual, but we can just refer to it as past states of affairs. That A is no longer actual. So there's not any mechanism that time is moving. Time isn't moving at all. It's just whatever causal interactions cause change. The change is in A. And so, for example, if it was a match and it lights, that's how it goes from A to B. Well, there wouldn't be a time that needs to move. There would just need to be the fact that the match strikes and it lights. And then there would be a past state of affairs where it wasn't lit, and a present state of affairs where it is lit. And then in virtue of these having temporal relationships, earlier than and later than relationships, you would have time. And so there wouldn't be a mechanism for time to move because time doesn't move. Time isn't a thing. It's just a way of referring to states of affairs of things that actually exist. Does that make sense?
Yeah. No, I think I think that that's an interesting perspective that I think like in our discussions, it's a perspective that I haven't um quite like thought deeply about because it's often been presented in terms of like this like ultra realist view of time that like time is this thing that is like marching forward and then we're kind of just caught up in it all. Um,
Yeah. So it sounds
so
like he's kind of importing the substantive view of time that you get from space
Mhm.
time, and he's importing that into presentism and thinking
Right.
of it like a corridor that you're walking down. And it's like, well, how do you move past the doors in the corridor? But yeah, there's no need to think that it's an actual substance on presentism.
Right. Yeah, no, interesting.
And then the other thing with relativity is it's a common misunderstanding that relativity implies the B theory. It doesn't. In fact, Einstein's initial interpretation of relativity was an A theory interpretation. Lorentz's interpretation was and is an A theory interpretation. It's been modernized into the neo-Lorentzian view, but the B theory comes from the Minkowski interpretation of relativity. And so there are different interpretations. Einstein did eventually abandon his initial interpretation, but if it were the case that relativity necessarily entails the B theory, it's hard to see how Einstein would have held the A theory while affirming general relativity. That seems problematic. Currently, the neo-Lorentzian and the Minkowski interpretations, they're actually empirically equivalent. And so it's not science that can really differentiate between the two. It's kind of like with quantum mechanics where there's some odd like 10 interpretations. But if they're all
Yeah.
empirically equivalent, then science just can't adjudicate between, if they predict the same things and they have the same empirical data, then you can't really work. You can't look to science. You have to look to something beyond science, which philosophy would be the thing to look at. And so I won't get into the specifics of relativity. It's kind of out of my field anyway. I'll just note that it's not the case that that if you're rejecting the B theory, you're rejecting relativity. What you'd be rejecting if you reject the B theory is the Minkowski interpretation of relativity, and you could then adopt an alternative interpretation. And if we have good reasons for rejecting the B theory, then those will count as good reasons for rejecting the Minkowski interpretation and reasons in favor of some alternative theory. Does that make sense?
Yeah. No, I reckon what I'll have to do is do a little bit more reading specifically on different interpretations of relativity,
Sure.
which I think could be quite fruitful in working through the particular models. So no, thank you for the advice on that front.
Thank you for listening. If you found this helpful, please like and subscribe. Please also look at the show notes in order to find a link to our group so that you can join our next discussion. I look forward to chatting with you.